On the 27th of May, 1541, an elderly lady was visited inside her rooms at the Tower of London and told that she was to die within the hour. Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, was shocked to her core, for although she had been living under a death sentence ever since her attainder nearly 3 years earlier, it seemed hopeful that she would be released from her imprisonment as her cousin Gertrude had been, but this was not to be. Shortly thereafter, the 67-year-old Countess was escorted out onto the small green inside the Tower of London's walls and beheaded in an execution which has become infamous for how badly botched it was. This was in fact the final dreadful act in a period known as the Exeter Conspiracy, which saw a total of 13 arrests and 8 executions, with Margaret being the most notable victim. But what actually was the Exeter Conspiracy? Where did it start? Who was involved? And is there any truth to the accusations that were made? Welcome back to the Tudor Chest podcast. What was the Exeter Conspiracy? Well, the first thing to say about the Exeter Conspiracy is that it remains precisely that: conspiracy. A conspiracy in which, if you believe it to be true, the old Plantagenet families of England plotted to overthrow King Henry VIII and replace him with Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, a grandson of King Edward IV. This is why it's known as the Exeter Conspiracy. In reality, the conspiracy is a mere title for something which would ultimately become much more serious. No irrefutable proof has ever been uncovered which would implicate those who would eventually lose their lives. Indeed, like other notable falls from grace during the reign of King Henry VIII, most notably of Anne Boleyn's, offhand and entirely natural responses between family members and close groups of friends could and would be turned into treason. The politics and the loyalties of the Pole family were well known, as was their close relationship to the Marquis and Marchioness of Exeter. While these families remained outwardly loyal to the king, their beliefs would be largely tolerated. However, as Reginald Pole continued to remain at liberty, freely in revolt against King Henry VIII, and protected by powerful friends in Europe, the king grew more and more incensed. His inability to get to Reginald had dire consequences for the Pole family, their servants and members of their kin, and in only 3 months, several members of England's preeminent families, the remnants of the great Plantagenet dynasty, were all but destroyed. This is known as the Exeter Conspiracy. So where did it all begin? Well, to start, let's look at Geoffrey Pole, the youngest son of Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Geoffrey was burgeoned by horrendous debts, and desperate to escape his creditors and flee abroad, he sought out communication with his exiled brother Reginald, using a servant of his, Hugh Holland, to convey messages from England into Italy. When this communication route was uncovered, and Hugh Holland arrived back in England, Thomas Cromwell had him promptly arrested. According to some sources, Holland did not respond well to his arrest, which led to a fight between himself and those sent to apprehend him. Reactions by the Pole family to Holland's arrest were mixed. Henry Pole, Baron Montague, the eldest of Margaret Pole's sons, was not especially worried at this stage, remarking that he always burned letters he received. Geoffrey was less circumspect and grew anxious. He instructed John Collins, a chaplain to Henry Pole, to travel to Lordington, Geoffrey's chief residence, to burn letters apparently held there. It is believed that this took place on the 21st of June 1538. Indeed, the action of burning letters would become central to the case brought forward against the Pole family. It is at this point that one Gervase Tyndall arrived on the scene. Tyndall, not to be confused with his infinitely more famous distant relative William Tyndall, was a failed schoolmaster who was deeply committed to religious reform. Tyndall had a working relationship with Thomas Cromwell that went back at least as far as 1535. His primary residence was Dean Park in Northamptonshire in the English Midlands, which makes his sudden appearance in Hampshire in the south of England certainly intriguing. Claiming sickness, he sought lodgings at the Surgeon's House, a sort of small hospital within the lands of Warblington Castle, which belonged to Lady Margaret Pole. It is probable, however, that the real reason for his arrival in Hampshire was on the orders of Cromwell, the latter hoping intelligence could be gathered on the dealings of the Pole family. Tyndale's illness was thus likely feigned. The chief surgeon of the property was a man called Richard Eyre, who naturally maintained regular contact with Margaret Pole and her family. What became clear was that Eyre, rather like Geoffrey Pole, had minimal prudence and was soon openly discussing the activities of the Pole family with Gervase Tyndale, precisely what Cromwell had been hoping for. Tyndale discovered that Eyre had reason to feel aggrieved at Margaret's influence over the county of Hampshire, and so he played on Eyre's already flimsy loyalties. Tyndale told Eyre that he would be able to organise a meeting directly with Thomas Cromwell. The offer clearly worked, for Eyre provided more salacious news, specifically on the activities of Hugh Holland and the significance of the intelligence that he was supposedly carrying over the English Channel and into Europe. He claimed that Holland conveyed letters to Master Pole, the Cardinal, and all the secrets of the realm of England are known to the Bishop of Rome as well as though he were here. Now, this accusation was explosive in the extreme, for letters to Reginald was one thing, but accusations of leaking state secrets to one of the king's great enemies was something else entirely. Eyre's testimony made it clear that contact between the Pole family and Reginald remained as strong as ever, and that the person who facilitated it was Hugh Holland. That was what justified Thomas Cromwell in ordering Holland's arrest. Soon, Tyndale had come into contact with practically every priest in the area surrounding Warblington, picking fights along the way with the men he deemed to be acting against the true word of God and, crucially, the desires of the king. This latter fact must be kept in mind because it solidified for Thomas Cromwell his growing suspicions that the Pole family remained hostile to the king's new policies and that for all of their lip service in ostensibly agreeing to them, that their true adherence to the traditions of the Catholic faith and by extension the Pope remained as strong as ever. News of Tyndale's activities across Hampshire soon reached Geoffrey Pole's ear, causing him significant distress. He journeyed to meet with Cromwell, taking Eyre and Holland along for good measure, hoping that getting the two men in front of Cromwell would assuage any concerns. Cromwell accepted Geoffrey's word, and he, Eyre and Holland left the Lord Privy Seal as they had found him. However, shortly after, Tyndale delivered his full report to Cromwell. The report provided all of the evidence that Cromwell needed to put in motion the first round of arrests, which started, as covered, with Hugh Holland. Upon entering the dreaded fortress of the Tower of London, Holland began to speak openly, making statements that seriously implicated Geoffrey Pole, but at this stage not the rest of the Pole family. The King's Guard came for Geoffrey quite suddenly on the last Monday of August 1538. The final examination of Hugh Holland took place on the 3rd of November of the same year. In his evidence, Hugh Holland paints a clear picture of how Geoffrey Pole had been working with his brother Reginald, which, by very definition, makes the youngest Pole brother unequivocally guilty of treason under the laws of the time. Geoffrey Pole would spend 2 whole months in the Tower of London before being examined for the first time on the 26th of October 1538, a week before Holland's final round of questioning. Already troubled by his financial woes, the act of leaving Geoffrey to stew was likely deliberate. No doubt terrified and by this point starving both literally and for want of human interaction, his captors perhaps hoped that a downtrodden Geoffrey Pole would be a more forthcoming figure than one well looked after. A key piece of evidence that has been ascribed to Geoffrey was supposed conversations based around a change in the world, with the most explosive take on this being a desired change in sovereign. Questioning Geoffrey was Sir William Fitzwilliam, Earl of Southampton, an imposing figure who had been one of the key forces in both the downfall of Anne Boleyn and in the suppression of the Pilgrimage of Grace. The first round of questions related entirely to Geoffrey's relationship with Reginald. How often had the brothers spoken? Had letters been passed to other members of the family by Geoffrey? Did Geoffrey agree with any of the slanders made by Reginald against the king? And so on. Given the nature of the accusations, the aforementioned change in the world was of political interest to the government and became central to the examinations against Geoffrey Pole. Under pressure, he soon told Southampton that his brother Henry Pole, Baron Montague, had been part of the group who had discussed the desired change. Hoping to lessen Montague's culpability, however, Geoffrey caveated his confession by saying that Montague had only meant a change in relation to religious policy and not in the person of the king directly. Unfortunately, these facts alone would prove inflammatory because in Holland's third examination, Baron Montague was discussed in greater detail. When his evidence was coupled with Geoffrey's words, it created major suspicion around the eldest Pole's son. Holland was able to recall with clarity that Henry Pole, Baron Montague, had several interactions with an old informant of Thomas Cromwell's, Michael Throckmorton. Now, while at one point this would have been deemed safe, the situation had changed entirely, for Cromwell had uncovered proof that Throckmorton had been playing double agent all along. Any association to Throckmorton thus had the scope to become deeply problematic. For the Poles, a family whose members were already under investigation, such association wasn't problematic, it was catastrophic. If Holland is to be believed, it was also to Holland and Throckmorton that Montague would utter one of the most well-documented pieces of evidence brought forward against him. Montague, we are told, said that those who flocked to the king's court were mere flatterers and that none served the king but knaves. At Holland's home, Montague supposedly went further, expressing his desire that they were both oversee with the Bishop of Liege, for this world would one day come to stripes. Now, at a distance of nearly 500 years, it is difficult to say exactly what Montague meant by coming to stripes. He could have meant a general breakdown of social norms or yet more radical shifts in the king's policies. Either way, his words were naturally viewed in a negative light. Geoffrey Pole would undergo 2 further rounds of questioning, which took place on the 2nd and 3rd of November. The situation was becoming graver with every passing day, and understandably, Geoffrey began to crack. He began to speak freely to his captors and even went to the step of writing to the king directly, begging for a pardon. In a letter to Henry VIII, Geoffrey hoped that he may have good keeping and cherishing, and thereby somewhat comfort himself and have better state of himself, and he said he would truly and fully open all that he did know or may remember, whomsoever it touch, whether it be mother, brother, uncle, or any other whatsoever he be. Geoffrey was thus making it clear that he would talk, and that no degree of familial loyalty would unsteady his hand. With no response from the king forthcoming, the horror of realising what was happening finally set in. Geoffrey, frantic with fear, suffered a complete mental collapse. Entirely wretched and deeply troubled by having provided evidence against his own family, Geoffrey did the unthinkable. He attempted to commit suicide. He stabbed himself in the chest, but the attempt failed. This should not, however, downplay the severity of such an action. Suicide was considered to be one of, if not the gravest of sins in the 16th century. It was contrary to God's law, something Geoffrey, as a member of a family so entrenched in the traditions of the Catholic faith, would have known all too well. That he would thus attempt such an act speaks volumes about his state of mind. It was in Geoffrey's 3rd examination that he more dangerously implicated Gertrude, the Marchioness of Exeter, the wife of Henry Courtenay, Marquis of Exeter, and another lady of the court, Elizabeth Darrell. Geoffrey gave evidence to suggest that it was Darrell who had been responsible for leaking the information to him about the planned assassination of Reginald Pole. As Geoffrey tells it, on hearing the news, he rushed to his brother Henry Pole's residence. He told Montague, "I hear our brother beyond the sea shall be slain," to which Montague replied, "No, he is escaped. I have letters." The evidence Geoffrey provided which placed Gertrude Courtenay in danger was in relation to a letter that the Marchioness had sent to Montague. When news of the Pole family coming under suspicion reached the King's Council, the Marquis of Exeter had supposedly said aloud that he would be bound body for body for him, meaning Montague. If true, this was a dangerous and brave move by Henry Courtenay. The reputation of the Pole family was sinking fast, so to place his lot in with Montague shows clear evidence of the two men's continued close relationship. Unfortunately for the Marquis, his name had also been brought up by Geoffrey during his interrogations in the Tower. Geoffrey had told his captors that he had not spoken with him, meaning Courtenay, for nearly 2 years, but by his communications with Lord Montague during these 2 years, he knows that the Marquis and his said brother were of one opinion. Now naturally, this one opinion was viewed with considerable suspicion. The very day after Geoffrey's final examination, the largest number of arrests took place. The Marquis of Exeter was the most senior arrestee. Shortly after arriving at the Tower of London, his wife Gertrude and their young son Edward were also arrested and joined him. Sir Edward Neville, a brother of Montague's father-in-law, George Baron Bergavenny, was also taken. The final major arrest was Montague himself. According to Charles Risley, Montague was conveyed by boat to the Tower early in the morning alongside his wife Jane and their son Henry Pole the younger. Lady Margaret Pole now had 2 of her sons and a grandson in prison, and her 3rd son constantly on the run from paid assassins. Later that month, in a letter to Sir Thomas Wyatt, Cromwell defended the arrests of Montague and Exeter, stating that they had committed sundry great crimes, and that the arrests were justified owing to the significant evidence and confessions collected. The situation looked bleak for all concerned, with the intended outcome all but a foregone conclusion. Although only French ambassador to Henry VIII's court for just over a year, Louis de Perrot, Sieur de Castillon, provides some of the greatest insight available from the period of the Exeter Conspiracy. He states quite plainly that the king told me a long time ago he wants to exterminate the house of Montague that belongs to the White Rose, the Pole family, of which the cardinal is a member. The inclusion of Reginald in the statement is telling, for it suggests that he was viewed as the chief cause of his family's misfortune. Indeed, Cromwell had as good as said as much, observing that the folly of one brain-sick Pole, or to say better, of one witless fool, should be the ruin of so great a family. And yet, as we know, the conspiracy stretched beyond purely the Pole family, so the root cause for all of the arrests cannot solely be laid at Reginald's feet. What then was the evidence produced which justified the arrests of the Marquis of Exeter and his family now lodged in the Tower? Well, the earliest piece of intelligence brought forward against Exeter was in relation to a comment that he had apparently made in 1536 from his home in West Horsley in Surrey. According to the report, he said that he liked well the proceedings of the Cardinal Pole, and shortly after, he told Henry Pole, "I trust to have a fair day upon these knaves which rule about the king, and I trust to see a merry world one day." The notion of a merry world was all too similar in tone to the change in the world story which had imprisoned the Pole brothers. The evidence, such as it was, had clear correlation between the two families and became increasingly difficult to refute. Geoffrey Pole had also told his examiners that he had overheard his brother Montague say that he would rather live in the West Country, for in the West the Lord Marquis of Exeter is strong. Were this the case, it implied that Montague felt Exeter's strength was something that could be used against the crown. One of the more serious allegations made against Exeter was that he had been leaking secrets to Montague from meetings of the Privy Council. Although Montague was a member of the nobility, he was not so high as to reach the hallowed position of a Privy Councillor. That was the reserve of the very highest of the male aristocracy, to which the Marquis of Exeter belonged. According to Geoffrey, Montague knew all that was done in the council when the Lord Marquis was there. If true, this was both very dangerous and highly foolish. We must not forget that the government had evidence from Gervase Tyndall that Hugh Holland had conveyed letters to Reginald which may have contained within them important state secrets. If the Marquis of Exeter was indeed revealing the inner workings of the council to Montague, then how much further would these secrets travel? Could they have made their way to Reginald and the Pope? The two scenarios shared all too much similarity to be overlooked. Of the noblemen arrested, the evidence against Henry Pole, Baron Montague, was the most extensive, and as with the other arrestees, the bulk of the information against him was produced through his own brother Geoffrey's statements. One of the most damning pieces of evidence against Montagu is in response to his father-in-law's death. Montagu is said to have expressed his sadness at the death of Baron Bergaveni, not for the personal loss, but for the 10,000 men that Bergaveni had at his disposal. Whilst much of the evidence brought forward against those arrested is open to significant conjecture, if Henry Pole did truly express sadness at the loss of such considerable numbers, who we are to assume would have done Bergaveni's bidding, then this does suggest that rebellion was something that they were at least weighing up. One of the most explosive pieces of evidence used to justify Montagu's arrest was a statement in which he mentioned the king's potential death. He is said to have exclaimed, "The king gloried with the title to be supreme head next to God, yet he had a sore leg that no man would be glad of, and that he would not live long for all his authority next God's." Now, to think of, let alone outwardly speak of the king's death was now a treasonous act. It was this, we must keep in mind, that justified the death sentence passed against Anne Boleyn in the spring of 1536. If such a course of action had been used against the wife of the king, it did not bode well for a man who himself had royal blood and whose wider family were already viewed with such damning suspicion. A servant of Montagu's, Jerome Ragland, also gave evidence against his master and seemed to corroborate what Geoffrey had revealed about Montagu. According to Ragland, when the king, in a fit of rage, threatened to leave England altogether, Montagu had quipped that the people of England would be pleased to see him go. An apparent tension between Montagu and Geoffrey also comes out in the evidence listed from Geoffrey's 7th examination. Although Margaret Pole is viewed as the head of the Pole family, her position at this stage at least was more de facto, working alongside Montagu, who, as the family's representative at court, ultimately held the most sway. Geoffrey told his examiners that despite wanting to serve in the king's household, Montagu had encouraged him against it, informing his brother that he should serve the Lady Dowager. Now, no further examination as to whom the Lady Dowager was is recorded, but given the Pole family's adherence to the interests of Catherine of Aragon, and the fact that after Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn took place, the Dowager Princess of Wales became Catherine's official title, it seems reasonable to assume that this was who Montagu felt Geoffrey should serve. If true, Montagu was essentially saying that service to Catherine of Aragon was a more desirable post than serving the king. As Geoffrey tells it, his appointment to the king's household was thus of his own volition and was contrary to his eldest brother's wishes, the latter of whom saying the king would go so far that all the world would mislike him, before confessing his own dislike of the king that he had supposedly held since childhood. All of this evidence on face value points to an unadulterated contempt for Henry VIII by Henry Pole, but we should also remain cognizant of the fact that Geoffrey had told the king that he would be willing to say whatever was asked of him, whether it incriminated his mother or brothers or otherwise. His recent attempt at suicide points to a man both deeply troubled and desperate. That he was speaking the truth is entirely possible, but it's equally reasonable to assume that Geoffrey entered a mode of pure self-preservation, saying whatever he thought his captors wished to hear. Some of Montagu's statements were certainly inflammatory, as were those made by the Exeters, but these may have been mere banter between friends, as opposed to a premeditated and detailed conspiracy. Once inside the tower, examinations of the prisoners would begin. Unlike Geoffrey Pole, Henry Pole, Baron Montagu, maintained a steady hand. Stoic, clear and concise, he would be questioned only once. Montagu denied everything, save admitting to the burning of letters. Such an action could mean everything and nothing, and it was in those grey areas that so often interpretation could be viewed with the most damning of conclusions. Perhaps in a twist of irony, Montagu's sang-froid aided his undoing. Where Geoffrey was emotionally demonstrative, putting it all out there for his captors to see, Montagu remained guarded and calm. Whilst one assessment could be that this was purely down to Montagu being genuinely innocent, to his captors it conveyed at best impertinence and at worst hidden treason. As the situation continued to unfold, Margaret Pole remained in the country of her favoured residence at Warblington. Naturally, news soon reached Margaret about Geoffrey's attempt at suicide. A concerned steward in her household told the Countess directly that, "I pray God, madam, he do you no hurt one day," to which Margaret, in an inspired bit of public relations, shot back, "I trust he is not so unhappy that he will hurt his mother." Margaret retained her liberty for now, but must surely have known that her freedom was on borrowed time. Montague and Margaret had been responsible for the elevation of the Pole family to the zenith of Tudor England, but if Margaret's sons were under such intense pressure, it was natural that Margaret herself would be tarred with the same brush. The next inevitable stage in the Pole family's destruction was when news broke that there was sufficient evidence to move to trial for Montague, which was to take place on the 2nd of December 1538, with the Marquis of Exeter's call to the bar scheduled for the following day. As befitting their rank, both men would be judged by a jury of their peers. The charges read out against Montague were that he had spoken out against the king, had envisioned the king's death, and remained in contact with and thus approved of the activities of his brother Reginald. When asked how he would plead, Montague declared not guilty. This small detail is all the information we have from the trial, save that it appears to have been relatively fair, with no hint of rigging among the judges. The Marquis of Exeter would also plead not guilty at his trial. Despite the two men's protests, the sentence of guilty was passed, and with it the customary judgment of death. Because of the charges laid against the accused, particularly Montague, there was zero hope of a reprieve. If the evidence presented was accurate, then, by the laws of the time, Montague had indeed committed treason. And this is why. Following the revisions made to the Treasons Act of 1534, it was stated clearly that, if any person do maliciously wish, will, or desire, by words or writing or by craft, imagine any bodily harm to be done or committed to the king's most royal person, he is guilty of high treason. As a reminder, this meant that even imagining the king's death was a treasonous offence, so openly speaking of it was a graver crime still. Even if the statement was made in general conversation, without spite or desire, it was enough for the perpetrator had envisioned the king's death. Montague's supposed pronouncement about Henry VIII's sore leg, ensuring the king should not live long for all his authority next God's, had thus crossed a line which, when applied to the very specific structures of treason laws of the time, rendered him guilty. As precedents dictated, Montague, Exeter, and the third nobleman involved, Sir Edward Neville, were soon informed that their sentence had been commuted to the far swifter death by decapitation rather than the horrors of being hung, drawn and quartered, which had initially been what had been given to the men. On the 9th of December, a Monday, Montague, Exeter and Neville took the short walk from their lodgings inside the Tower of London out onto Tower Hill to meet their ends as so many had done before them. Against howling winds and torrential rain, the three men prepared themselves for death, with Exeter as the highest in rank, dying first. Given his stout denials of guilt throughout the trial, there was some concern that the Marquis would use his time on the scaffold to reassert his innocence. However, Exeter had accepted his fate and gave the customary speech from the scaffold in which he admitted to being a sinner worthy of death. Montague would die afterwards, and then lastly, Neville. Despite the significance of the men on the scaffold and the overall scale and drama of the Exeter Conspiracy, there are no detailed accounts of their final moments. Only a cursory description was made by Richard Morrisine, who mentioned that the men did all three acknowledge their offences towards the king and desired all men that were present to pray God to forgive them. My reading of the evidence, if taken one way, certainly points towards planned treason by the Pole and Exeter families, but, viewed through a different lens, it could be argued that those involved in the Exeter Conspiracy scandal were less a political party than a gang of friends made up of people who longed for a return to the traditions of the Catholic faith without the prudence to keep those thoughts to themselves. Thoughts and words were now treason, and so even if it was mere talk, that was enough. Crucially, we must also remember that hatred for Cromwell and everything that he stood for united those arrested and executed. This fact is germane when considering all the evidence at large. If we accept the significance of Cromwell's role in the downfall of Anne Boleyn, then his hand in the downfall of the Pole family and those who fell with them must be considered. He had ousted a queen, so courtiers with a claim to the throne who opposed his policies were naturally a significant threat. As far as blame goes, it is my belief that the responsibility for the whole notion of the Exeter Conspiracy most convincingly lands at Reginald and Geoffrey's feet. But it is precisely because of the Pole and Courtenay families' blood that their actions were all the more problematic. It exacerbated their faults, it made them more open to suspicion. At its crux, the Exeter Conspiracy is less a conspiracy and more a series of events with two distinct stories to tell. On one side, you had the familial unity which brought together the remaining Plantagenets on the Yorkist side. They comprised a wide network of people who, by virtue of their birth, were either royal or highly noble, effectively a spider's web of cousins, siblings and kin stretching across the whole of England. To their supporters, they represented the best of the country, but to their detractors, they were a ready-made affront to the fledgling Tudor dynasty. Secondly, there was the ever-present uncertainty, which must have been acute for all Tudor monarchs to live with, particularly Henry VII and Henry VIII, that the Tudors ultimately had only a slight claim to the throne of England. The presence of so many Plantagenets was thus a constant reminder of what came before, a legitimate, unquestionably royal family and one known for breeding like rabbits. When these factors are combined, alongside Reginald Pole's behaviour, that then is the basis for what the Exeter Conspiracy became. The latter point around Reginald is the most important though, for had Reginald Pole not behaved as he did, then I firmly believe that the idea of the Exeter Conspiracy simply wouldn't have been a thing. It was created in response to Reginald's behaviour. And to this end, the period should probably be rechristened from the Exeter Conspiracy into the problem Pole. And so that brings me to the end of this week's episode of the Tudor Chest podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Next week, it is a return to my regular episode format where I will be welcoming back onto the podcast Emma Rutherford and Elizabeth Goldring for a discussion about a remarkable new portrait miniature of the Earl of Southampton that they have been involved in uncovering. And what makes this so, I suppose, unusual is just how feminine he looks in this portrait. One would be easily forgiven, indeed I did think, until I dove into the story in a bit more detail, that it wasn't a woman at all. Tune in next Thursday to hear all about that. Thank you again for listening to the Tudor Chess podcast, and speak soon.